Resident Evil 1996, should it be remade again? There's a conversation happening in the Resident Evil community right now, and it's one that brings up questions that go far beyond a single game. The question is simple on its surface but complex underneath. Should Resident Evil, the original 1996 game that started it all, be remade again? Not remastered, not ported, remade from the ground up using modern technology, the way Capcom did with Resident Evil 2, 3, and 4 in recent years. This isn't idle speculation. Rumors have circulated for years about a potential second remake of the first game, timed perhaps to coincide with the franchise's 30th anniversary. Some of these rumors have been dismissed by insiders, others have gained traction, and still others exist in that strange limbo where something feels simultaneously inevitable and impossible. What's interesting isn't whether the remake will happen, though that's certainly part of the discussion, but rather whether it should happen at all. To understand this question fully, we need to explore two opposing viewpoints. First, there's a compelling argument that yes, Resident Evil 1996 deserves a second remake. The original PlayStation game was revolutionary, but it's nearly 30 years old. Gaming has changed. Player expectations have evolved. The remake from 2002 was magnificent, but it still carried design philosophies from an earlier era. Tank controls, fixed camera angles, pre-rendered backgrounds. Modern Resident Evil games have moved beyond these limitations, creating something that feels cohesive and unified across the recent entries. Why shouldn't the game that started it all benefit from the same treatment? But then there's the counter-argument, and it's just as persuasive. The 2002 remake of Resident Evil isn't just good, it's extraordinary. It's widely considered not only one of the best remakes ever made in any medium, but one of the finest horror games, period. It accomplished something rare. It took a beloved original and elevated it in every conceivable way while preserving everything that made it special. When you have a remake that perfect, that definitive, do you really need to remake it again? And beyond that specific case, there's a broader question about the gaming industry itself. When do we stop remaking the past and start creating new futures? Let's explore both sides of this argument thoroughly, because the answer matters not just for Resident Evil, but for gaming as an art form. The case for remaking Resident Evil 1996. Again, the argument for a second remake of Resident Evil begins with a simple observation: the gaming landscape has changed dramatically since 2002. When Capcom released the GameCube remake 23 years ago, it was working within the technological and design constraints of that era. The remake used pre-rendered backgrounds just like the original, albeit far more detailed and atmospheric. It retained the fixed camera angles that defined classic survival horror. And yes, it kept the tank controls, that notorious control scheme where pushing forward always moves the character in the direction they're facing, requiring you to stop and turn before moving in a new direction. At the time, these weren't seen as limitations. They were design choices, deliberate decisions that served the game's atmosphere and tension. The fixed cameras created cinematic compositions and hid threats. The tank controls made combat feel desperate and awkward, which enhanced the survival horror experience. These weren't bugs, they were features. But player expectations have evolved, and what felt like intentional design in 2002 can feel like dated mechanics in 2025. Consider what Capcom accomplished with the Resident Evil 2 remake in 2019. That game took a beloved classic and completely reimagined it with an over-the-shoulder camera, modernized controls, and a level of atmospheric detail that the original could only dream of. The police station wasn't just more detailed, It was fundamentally different in how you experienced it. You could look around, aim freely, move intuitively. The game felt immediate and immersive in a way that the original, for all its brilliance, couldn't match with its fixed perspectives and pre rendered environments. And here's the crucial point: despite all those changes, the remake of Resident Evil 2 didn't just preserve what made the original special, it enhanced it. The horror was more visceral, the storytelling was more nuanced. Characters who were somewhat one dimensional in the original became fully realized people. Leon Kennedy went from a rookie cop with bad hair to a compelling protagonist. Claire Redfield gained depth and agency. Even the relationship between Mr. X and the player became something new and terrifying, with the tyrant stalking you through the police station, his footsteps echoing through the halls, creating a sense of persistent dread that the original could suggest but never fully realize with its technical limitations. The success of that remake proved something important. You can radically alter how a game plays and still honor its essence. You can modernize without betraying. The Resident Evil 4 remake in 2023 reinforced this lesson. The original RE4 was already nearly perfect, widely considered one of the greatest games ever made. What could a remake possibly add? As it turned out, quite a lot. The remake refined the pacing, deepened the characters, added new encounters and areas, and created something that stood alongside the original as an equal, perhaps even, in some ways, as a superior version. If Capcom could do this for Resident Evil 2 and 4, games that were already excellent, what could they do with the first game? The 2002 remake was masterful, yes, but imagine experiencing the Spencer Mansion with the same level of detail and environmental storytelling that the recent remakes achieved. Imagine exploring those halls with modern controls, a dynamic camera, fully rendered environments that you can inspect and interact with in real time. Imagine the Lisa Trevor encounter, already one of the most haunting additions the 2002 remake made, brought to life with modern graphics and animation. The mansion itself could become even more of a character. In the 2002 remake, the environments were gorgeous, lovingly detailed pre-rendered backgrounds that created an incredible atmosphere, but they were still static images, fundamentally no different in approach from the original's FMV backgrounds. A modern remake could create a living, breathing mansion where every object exists in three-dimensional space, where lighting changes dynamically, where you can examine details that add to the environmental storytelling in ways the 2002 remake couldn't achieve. Think about the narrative possibilities. The 2002 remake expanded the story significantly from the original, adding the Lisa Trevor subplot and fleshing out the mansion's backstory, but it was still constrained by the technology and storytelling conventions of its time. Modern game writing has evolved. Look at how the recent remakes handle character development and dialogue. They took the camp and cheese of the originals and found the sweet spot between honoring that legacy and creating something that feels contemporary. They added depth without losing charm. A modern remake could do the same for the first game's characters. Jill Valentine and Chris Redfield are iconic, but their characterization in both the original and the 2002 remake is somewhat thin. The recent games have shown what Capcom can do with these characters when given modern tools and sensibilities. Imagine a version of the Spencer Mansion incident that gives these characters the depth that Leon and Claire received in RE2's remake. Imagine Barry Burton being more than a source of memes about Master of Unlocking and Jill sandwiches. Imagine Wesker's betrayal being built up with more subtlety and dramatic weight. And then there's the question of accessibility and cohesion. The Resident Evil franchise has spent the last several years creating a unified style and feel across its remake catalog. Resident Evil 2, 3, and 4 all play similarly, all use the same engine, all share a design philosophy. They feel like they belong to the same family, but the first game stands apart. The 2002 remake, for all its quality, doesn't fit with this new direction. It's an outlier, a relic from a different era of game design. For new players discovering the series, this creates a jarring experience. They might play the recent remakes and love them, then go back to try the first game and find something that feels fundamentally different. The fixed cameras are disorienting. The tank controls are frustrating. The pre-rendered backgrounds, while beautiful, create a disconnect from the more immersive 3D environments of the newer games. They might bounce off it, never experiencing the story that started everything. A modern remake would solve this problem, creating a consistent experience across the entire remake series. There's also the practical consideration of game preservation and accessibility. The 2002 remake, while remastered in HD in 2015, is still fundamentally a game from another era. As gaming continues to evolve, it risks becoming even more inaccessible to newer audiences. The longer Capcom waits, the more the 2002 remake will feel like a museum piece, interesting historically, but not something modern players naturally gravitate toward. A contemporary remake would ensure that the first Resident Evil story remains accessible and relevant for generations to come. The commercial argument is straightforward too. Capcom has proven that Resident Evil remakes print money. Resident Evil 2's remake became the best-selling game in the franchise's history. Resident Evil 4's remake was similarly successful. There's a demonstrated market for these projects, and the first game has name recognition that rivals or exceeds any other entry in the series. It's the game that started it all. A remake would likely be enormously profitable, which in turn funds new projects, experimental ideas, the next generation of Resident Evil games. Some might argue that remaking the remake is unnecessary because we can still play the 2002 version. This is technically true. The HD remaster is available on every modern platform, but availability isn't the same as relevance. We can still watch the original Star Wars trilogy, but that didn't stop George Lucas from creating special editions, and it didn't stop Disney from continuing the franchise with new entries. We can still read the original Sherlock Holmes stories, but that doesn't stop creators from reimagining the character for contemporary audiences. Art exists in dialogue with its time, and what resonated in 2002 might need reinterpretation to resonate in 2025 and beyond. The technology argument extends beyond just graphics and controls. Modern game engines allow for systemic interactions that weren't possible in 2002. Imagine the mansion's puzzles taking advantage of fully simulated physics. Imagine enemy AI that creates truly emergent, unpredictable encounters rather than following scripted patterns. Imagine environmental destruction, dynamic lighting that affects gameplay, weather systems that change the atmosphere. These aren't just visual upgrades, they're gameplay opportunities that could make a modern remake feel substantively different from what came before. Consider also the pacing and structure. The 2002 remake was relatively faithful to the original structure, with some significant additions and changes. But game design has learned so much in the past 2 decades about pacing, about when to provide action and when to pull back, about how to use space and backtracking in ways that feel purposeful rather than repetitive. The recent Resident Evil remakes demonstrate this advanced understanding of pacing. A new take on the first game could apply these lessons. creating an experience that feels tighter and more deliberately constructed while still maintaining the core exploration and discovery that made the original special. And what about the multiplayer experiments that Resident Evil has attempted over the years? While the core experience should remain single player, a modern remake could potentially include co op options similar to what Resident Evil 5 and 6 offered, but implemented more thoughtfully. The first game already has two playable characters with different campaigns. Imagine if you could play through Jill's story with a friend playing as Barry, or Chris's story with a friend as Rebecca. This wouldn't have to replace the single player experience. It could be an optional mode that adds replayability and brings new players into the fold. The argument for a remake also acknowledges that new generations of players deserve to experience this story in a format that feels native to their gaming literacy. Someone who grew up playing Fortnite, Elden Ring, and The Last of Us Part Isu has a different relationship with game controls and cameras than someone who grew up with the PlayStation and N64. This isn't about dumbing games down, it's about recognizing that design languages evolve and what feels intuitive changes over time. A modern remake would speak the current language of games while telling the classic story. There's also something to be said about the benefit of hindsight. When the 2002 remake was made, Capcom was only a few years past the original. They knew what worked, but they didn't have the perspective that comes from seeing how the entire franchise evolved over decades. Now, with the benefit of 8 main numbered entries, countless spin offs, and a complete franchise arc, Capcom knows exactly what elements of the first game proved essential to the series' DNA and what was experimental or exploratory. A modern remake could be more surgical in what to preserve and what to reinvent. The franchise itself has grown more narratively ambitious. The recent games have woven together plot threads across multiple entries, creating a cohesive mythology. But the first game, in both its original and 2002 remake forms, exists somewhat apart from this. Its story connects to the larger franchise, obviously, but it was made before that larger franchise existed. A modern remake could be more deliberate about setting up the dominoes that fall throughout the series, about establishing characters and concepts that pay off in later games, about creating a more unified narrative experience across the entire franchise. Furthermore, there's the question of what Capcom has learned about horror itself. The recent games show a studio that has deeply studied what makes horror effective in games. The sense of pursuit in RE2 Remake's Mr. X sequences, the grotesque body horror in RE7, the gothic nightmare of Village, the psychological weight of RE4's remake. All of these games demonstrate a sophistication in their horror that wasn't present or wasn't possible in 2002. Applying that knowledge to the Spencer Mansion, to Crimson Heads and Hunters and the Tyrant could create something that's not just scarier, but scary in more varied and interesting ways. The case for a remake also considers what it would mean for the franchise's future. Capcom has indicated that more remakes are likely. Code Veronica and Zero are frequently mentioned as candidates. But before moving forward chronologically, there's value in establishing a definitive starting point. Remaking the first game with the same technology and design philosophy as the recent remakes would create a solid foundation for everything that comes after. It would allow the entire mainline series to eventually exist in a cohesive, modernized form. There's also the simple fact that the Spencer Mansion is one of the most iconic locations in gaming history, but most people under 30 have never actually explored it themselves. They know it through cultural osmosis, through YouTube videos and retrospectives, but they haven't experienced it firsthand. The 2002 remake's control scheme and camera create too much friction for many modern players to push through. A remake that removes that friction while preserving the magic could introduce a new generation to this legendary location in a way they can actually engage with. Consider too the potential for expanding what the 2002 remake added. Lisa Trevor was a brilliant addition, a tragic figure that added emotional depth to the mansion's horrors. But she was essentially a side story, encountered in a few specific locations. A modern remake could weave her presence throughout the entire game, making her a more central element of both the horror and the narrative. Similarly, other story elements could be expanded or added, perhaps more details about the mansion's history, more encounters with other STARS members, more insight into Umbrella's operations. The technology available now also allows for more sophisticated survival horror mechanics. The recent games have shown how resource management can be tense without being frustrating, how combat can feel desperate without feeling cheap, how save systems can create pressure without feeling punitive. All the rough edges that even the 2002 remake had, the sometimes unclear puzzle solutions, the occasional backtracking that felt like padding, the inventory management that could be tedious, could be smoothed out while maintaining the essential survival horror challenge. And perhaps most compellingly, a remake could do what the best remakes do: surprise people who think they know the story. The Resident Evil 4 remake proved this. People who had played the original dozens of times found themselves genuinely surprised by new encounters, new story beats, new ways familiar scenarios played out. A remake of the first game could do the same, honoring the familiar beats while introducing new elements that make even veterans feel like they're discovering something for the first time. The argument for a remake is ultimately an argument for evolution. It's saying that the 2002 remake was perfect for its time, but times change. It's saying that the story of the Spencer Mansion is important enough, foundational enough, to warrant being retold in the language of contemporary games. It's saying that new players deserve to experience this story without having to engage with outdated control schemes and design philosophies. And it's saying that Capcom has proven, repeatedly, that they can honor the past while creating something that stands on its own as a modern masterpiece. The case against remaking Resident Evil 1996. Again, but now we need to consider the other side, because while the arguments for a remake are compelling, the arguments against it are equally powerful, perhaps even more so. Let's start with the fundamental question: when is something already perfect? The 2002 remake of Resident Evil isn't just good, it's a genuine masterpiece that achieves something incredibly rare in the world of remakes. It took a beloved original and improved it in virtually every way while losing nothing of what made it special. The graphics were a generational leap forward. The mansion was more detailed, more atmospheric, more haunting. New areas were added, new enemies were introduced. The Crimson Head system added strategic depth. Lisa Trevor became one of gaming's most tragic and terrifying characters. But more importantly, the remake understood what made the original work and enhanced those elements rather than changing them. The fixed camera angles weren't a limitation to work around, they were a core part of the horror, creating compositions that made you feel watched, that hid threats, that turned every doorway into a potential nightmare. The tank controls weren't outdated. They made movement feel deliberate and dangerous, making you commit to every step, making combat feel desperate. The pre-rendered backgrounds weren't a compromise. They allowed for a level of detail and atmosphere that even modern real-time graphics struggled to match. This is what makes the 2002 remake so special. It wasn't trying to modernize the original. It was trying to perfect it, and it succeeded. The result is a game that 23 years later still stands as one of the finest examples of survival horror ever created. It's not just historically significant, it's still genuinely great to play. The horror still works. The atmosphere is still suffocating. The mansion is still one of gaming's most memorable locations. Nothing about it feels lesser just because it's older. When you have something that's already this good, remaking it again starts to feel less like creative ambition and more like creative bankruptcy. It's saying that we can't leave well enough alone, that nothing can ever be finished, that everything must be endlessly updated and modernized regardless of whether it needs it. It's the mentality that leads to George Lucas constantly tinkering with Star Wars, replacing practical effects with CGI, adding unnecessary scenes, changing fundamental moments because he can rather than because he should. The 2002 remake doesn't need to be improved. It needs to be preserved, celebrated, and played. The HD remaster in 2015 did exactly what was needed. It made the game accessible on modern platforms with improved resolution and some quality of life options while leaving the core experience untouched. That's all it required. Going further, creating a fundamentally different version with modern controls and a dynamic camera would be creating something else entirely. It wouldn't be improving the remake, it would be replacing it. And here's where we get to the heart of the matter, the broader implications for the gaming industry. The constant remaking of games isn't happening in a vacuum. It's part of a larger trend where the industry increasingly looks backward rather than forward, where nostalgia is monetized, where proven properties are endlessly recycled, while new ideas struggle to find funding. Look at the release calendar over the past few years. Resident Evil 2 Remake, Resident Evil 3 Remake, Final Fantasy 7 Remake, The Last of Us Part 1 Remake, Demon's Souls Remake, Dead Space Remake, Silent Hill 2 Remake, Resident Evil 4 Remake, and on and on. These aren't bad games. Many of them are excellent, but they're not new games. They're revisitations of past glories, and increasingly they're crowding out original work. The problem isn't that remakes exist. The problem is that they're becoming the default rather than the exception. Publishers have figured out that remakes are safer bets than new properties. They come with built-in audiences, proven concepts, known quantities. Marketing is easier. You're selling nostalgia rather than trying to convince people to take a chance on something unfamiliar. The financial risk is lower, but the creative cost is high. Every major studio that's dedicating resources to remaking a 20-year-old game is a studio that's not creating something new. Every talented developer brought on to recreate the Spencer Mansion is a developer who's not designing new locations, new stories, new experiences. Every dollar spent on bringing a classic into the modern era is a dollar not spent on creating tomorrow's classics. This is particularly troubling when you consider how it affects younger developers and new ideas. The games industry has a problem with risk aversion. Publishers want safe bets, proven franchises, established formulas. New intellectual properties face enormous skepticism and much tighter budgets. Original ideas are harder to get funded, harder to market, harder to succeed with, and remakes make this problem worse. When a studio has proven they can successfully remake Resident Evil 2 and make a fortune, why would a publisher fund their risky, original horror concept? Just remake Resident Evil 1 instead. It's safer. We know people will buy it. Why gamble on something new when you can guarantee returns with something old? This mentality, repeated across the industry, creates a creative stagnation that's slowly choking out innovation. The 2002 Resident Evil remake is an instructive case because it shows what happens when a remake is done for the right reasons at the right time. The original was 6 years old and hadn't aged particularly well graphically. The series was moving to new platforms. The technology had advanced enough to realize the original vision more fully. There was genuine creative ambition behind it. Shinji Mikami and his team wanted to create the definitive version of the game they'd made. They had new ideas about how to enhance it, new elements to add that deepened the experience. It wasn't a cash grab, it was an artistic statement. Contrast that with what a second remake would represent. The 2002 version is 23 years old, yes, but unlike the original in 2002, it hasn't aged poorly. It still looks fantastic. The gameplay still works. The horror still resonates. There's no technical reason it needs to be remade. And creatively, what would a new remake add that the 2002 version doesn't already have? Better graphics, sure, but diminishing returns. The jump from 1996 to 2002 was transformative. The jump from 2002 to 2025 would be incremental at best. Modern controls and camera, that's not an improvement, it's a fundamental change in what the game is. The fixed cameras and tank controls aren't bugs to be fixed. They're core to the game's identity, deliberately chosen to create a specific type of horror experience. Changing them would create something that plays like Resident Evil 2 Remake, which we already have. It wouldn't be the first game remade for modern times. It would be the first game turned into the second game. More story content. The 2002 remake already expanded significantly from the original. Lisa Trevor, new areas, revised encounters, deeper lore, it's all there. What more needs to be said? The Spencer Mansion incident isn't some complex narrative that demands deeper exploration. It's a straightforward story told effectively. Sometimes simplicity is a strength, not a weakness. The reality is that a second remake would be created not because it needs to exist creatively, but because it would make money. And that's fine. Gaming is a business, companies need to profit. But it's also a depressing statement about where we are as an industry. We've reached the point where we're remaking remakes, where nothing is ever finished, where the past is endlessly regurgitated because it's safer than creating the future. There's something almost dystopian about this. Imagine a gaming landscape where every major release is a remake or a sequel, where new franchises become increasingly rare, where entire studios are devoted to recreating games from the 1990s and 2000s rather than creating games for the 2020s and 2030s. We're not there yet, but we're sliding in that direction, and every new remake pushes us further down that slope. The 2002 Resident Evil remake should stand as a monument to what remakes can accomplish. It should be the gold standard, the example that proves how successful this approach can be when done right. But it should also be the end of the line. It should be the definitive version, the one that doesn't need improvement because it's already as good as it needs to be. Remaking it again would diminish its accomplishment, suggesting that even perfection is disposable, that everything must be endlessly updated for whatever the current technological standard happens to be. There's also a generational consideration here. The people who are nostalgic for the original 1996 Resident Evil are getting older. The people who are nostalgic for the 2002 remake are getting older too. At what point does the industry need to stop catering exclusively to nostalgia and start creating new experiences that will become the classics future generations feel nostalgic about? If we're always looking backward, always remaking the past, we're not building the future. New players, the argument goes, need modern controls and cameras to engage with the first game. But is that really true? Or have we just trained them to expect a certain type of game? The success of games like Dark Souls, with its deliberate, methodical combat and high difficulty, suggests that players are willing to engage with games that don't follow modern conventions if the experience is compelling enough. The popularity of retro-styled indie games suggests that pixel art and older design philosophies can still resonate. Maybe what new players need isn't a remake. Maybe they need to be challenged to meet the 2002 remake on its own terms, to understand that games can be designed differently, that fixed cameras and tank controls can create a specific type of experience that's valuable in its own right. Flattening every game into the same modern control scheme and camera perspective makes the medium more homogeneous, less diverse in its approaches to horror and gameplay. The preservation argument is also somewhat hollow. The 2002 remake is already preserved. It's available on every modern platform through the HD remaster. It's not some lost relic that requires archaeological excavation. It's right there, ready to be played, looking and running better than it did on the GameCube. If players choose not to engage with it because of its design choices, that's a choice they're making. Not every game needs to be updated for every preference. And let's talk about what would be lost in a remake. The pre-rendered backgrounds of the 2002 version aren't just beautiful. They represent a specific artistic style that's largely disappeared from gaming. Modern real-time graphics can do amazing things, but they have a different quality, a different feel. There's something painterly about those pre-rendered environments, something carefully composed about every shot. Real-time 3D is more flexible, more interactive, but it's also more homogeneous. Every modern game starts to look similar in a way, using the same engines, the same lighting techniques, the same approaches to rendering space. The fixed cameras, too, create a specific cinematic quality. They force the player to experience the game from the perspectives the designers chose, creating compositions and framings that tell the story visually. A dynamic camera gives the player control, which is often good, but it also means every player experiences the space differently. Sometimes the director needs to control what you see and how you see it. That's not a limitation, it's a legitimate artistic choice. Even the tank controls, controversial as they are, serve a purpose. They make you commit to movement. They make combat feel awkward and desperate. They create a specific sense of being in a space that more modern controls can't quite replicate. When you can strafe and backpedal freely, combat becomes more tactical and less panicky. That might make it more fun in a conventional sense, but it changes the horror fundamentally. These elements work together to create a cohesive whole. The 2002 Resident Evil remake isn't a collection of dated mechanics held together by nostalgia. It's a carefully designed experience where every element reinforces the others to create a specific type of horror. Changing any of those elements doesn't update the game, it breaks it. You'd end up with something that's neither the deliberate, composed horror of the remake nor the immersive, flexible horror of the modern games. It would be something in between, something compromised. The broader industry implications can't be ignored either. Every dollar Capcom spends on a second remake of Resident Evil is a dollar they're not spending on Resident Evil 9, or on a new franchise, or on experimental ideas that might fail but might also create something we've never seen before. Every hour a talented developer spends recreating the Spencer Mansion is an hour they're not spending imagining new locations, new stories, new kinds of horror. The games industry is already struggling with creative stagnation. Big publishers play it safe, sequels dominate the landscape, new intellectual properties are increasingly rare. Remakes exacerbate this problem. They provide a crutch, an easy out that lets companies avoid taking creative risks. Why fund the next great original horror game when you can remake Resident Evil 1 and guarantee sales? Why take a chance on a new franchise when you can mine the nostalgia of established ones? This creates a vicious cycle. Fewer new IPs are created because remakes are safer. Fewer new IPs succeed because they get smaller budgets and marketing pushes. Their failure reinforces the belief that original games are risky. More remakes get greenlit. The cycle continues. Eventually, you end up with an industry that's eating its own tail, endlessly recycling the same games because it's forgotten how to create new ones. And there's something sad about this. The original Resident Evil was revolutionary. It created a genre. It took risks. It tried something new and succeeded wildly. The 2002 remake honored that spirit of innovation while making it better. But a second remake? That's not honoring the legacy. That's strip mining it. It's saying that the only way we can succeed is by endlessly revisiting what worked 30 years ago. Games should move forward. They should create new stories, explore new ideas, invent new ways of creating horror and tension and engagement. The Resident Evil franchise has done this repeatedly throughout its history. Resident Evil 4 completely reinvented the series. Resident Evil 7 did it again, shifting to first person and creating something that felt fresh while still being recognizably Resident Evil. These weren't remakes, they were innovations. They pushed the series forward rather than looking backward. That's what we need more of. Not another trip to the Spencer Mansion with better graphics and modern controls, but new locations, new stories, new types of horror we haven't experienced before. The gaming industry should be creating the classics of tomorrow, not endlessly polishing the classics of yesterday. The 2002 remake of Resident Evil represents something important, proof that remakes can be done right, that they can honor the original while improving it, that they can become definitive versions that stand as artistic accomplishments in their own right. But part of what makes it special is that it knew when to stop. It didn't endlessly iterate. It achieved what it set out to do and then let that achievement stand. A second remake would undermine that. It would suggest that even the perfect remake isn't good enough, that everything must be endlessly updated, that nothing can ever be finished. It would be a symptom of an industry that's lost faith in its ability to create new things, that's become so risk averse and nostalgia driven that it can only function by remaking what already exists. The best argument against a second remake is simply this: the first remake is already perfect. When you've achieved perfection, the only direction you can go is down. The 2002 Resident Evil remake is a masterpiece that doesn't need improvement. It needs to be played, appreciated, and preserved as the artistic accomplishment it is. And the developers who might remake it should instead turn their considerable talents toward creating the next masterpiece, not recreating the last one. Why the 2002 remake is the gold standard. Let's talk specifically about what makes the 2002 Resident Evil remake so exceptional, because understanding its achievement is crucial to understanding why it shouldn't be remade again. When Shinji Mikami and his team at Capcom set out to remake the original Resident Evil for the GameCube, they weren't approaching it as a simple graphical update. They saw an opportunity to fully realize the vision they'd had for the original game, but couldn't achieve due to the PlayStation's technical limitations. The result was something that went far beyond what anyone expected. The environments were the first thing that grabbed people. The Spencer Mansion in the 2002 remake is one of the most meticulously detailed locations in gaming history. Every room feels lived in, with a sense of history and decay that's palpable. The grand halls and ornate furnishings speak to the mansion's past as a wealthy estate. The scientific equipment and hidden passages reveal its darker purpose. The way nature has begun to reclaim certain areas, with plants growing through floors and water damage staining walls, creates a sense of abandonment that's deeply unsettling. These pre rendered backgrounds allowed for an almost photorealistic level of detail that was simply impossible in real time 3D at the time. The lighting in particular creates an atmosphere that still holds up today. The way moonlight streams through windows, casting long shadows across dusty floors. The flicker of candlelight in the save rooms, creating islands of warmth in an otherwise hostile environment. The stark, institutional lighting in the underground laboratory areas, harsh and revealing. Every space has its own character, its own mood, achieved through careful composition and lighting design. The game also understood pacing in a way that many horror games don't. It knew when to provide action and when to pull back. The early game is relatively quiet, allowing you to explore and understand the mansion's layout. Enemies are sparse, giving you time to absorb the atmosphere, to read the documents that flesh out the backstory, to solve puzzles and uncover secrets. The horror during this phase is anticipatory, the dread of what might be around the next corner rather than constant threat. Then the game slowly escalates. More enemies appear. Tougher creatures are introduced. The Crimson Head system creates strategic decisions about which zombies to burn and which to avoid. The discovery of new areas, the guardhouse, the residence, the laboratory, provides fresh environments and new horrors. By the time you reach the end game, the mansion that once felt so oppressive has become almost familiar, and the game uses that familiarity against you by changing things, by placing threats in previously safe areas, by forcing you to navigate familiar spaces in new ways. Lisa Trevor deserves special mention because she represents one of the remake's most significant additions. She wasn't in the original game, and her inclusion wasn't just about adding a new enemy. It was about deepening the horror on a human level. Lisa is tragic. She's a victim, not a villain. Her presence adds an emotional weight to the mansion's atrocities that the original lacked. Every encounter with her is unsettling, not because she's particularly difficult to deal with, but because of what she represents: the cruelty of Umbrella's experiments, the human cost of their ambitions. Her backstory is told through scattered documents and environmental details: the chains on her feet, the mask she wears, cobbled together from the faces of her victims in a desperate attempt to regain her own identity. The way she shambles through the mansion's depths, trapped between life and death by the viruses that have transformed her body but left something of her consciousness intact. It's genuinely disturbing in a way that most video game horror isn't, because it's grounded in human suffering rather than just monster design. The Crimson Head system was another brilliant addition. In the original, once you killed a zombie, it stayed dead. In the remake, if you don't burn the body or destroy the head, it eventually reanimates as a Crimson Head, a much faster, more aggressive version that's harder to deal with. This creates a resource management puzzle that goes beyond just ammunition and healing items. Do you use your limited fuel to burn this body, preventing it from coming back? Or do you save it, gambling that you won't need to return through this area, or that you'll be able to dodge the Crimson Head if it does appear? This system makes every zombie encounter meaningful. You're not just fighting to survive the immediate threat, you're thinking about the future implications of how you handle it. It adds a strategic layer that makes the game more engaging while also increasing the horror. Those previously cleared rooms aren't safe anymore. The mansion becomes more dangerous over time if you don't manage the zombie threat properly. It's a simple mechanic that creates complex decision making and long-term consequences. The game's sound design deserves recognition too. The score is minimal and atmospheric, using silence effectively to build tension. Save rooms have their distinctive, melancholic theme that becomes psychologically comforting. The sound effects are meticulously crafted. The creak of floorboards, the groan of zombies, the crash of breaking glass, the distant thunder during storms. Everything contributes to the atmosphere without calling attention to itself. The voice acting and writing, while still sometimes hokey, are a massive improvement over the original. The infamous dialogue of the 1996 version, the Jill sandwich, the master of unlocking, has become legendary for its awkwardness. The remake tones this down significantly. The dialogue is still pulpy in that B-movie way that defines Resident Evil, but it's delivered competently. The story beats land with appropriate weight. The characters feel like actual people rather than collections of one-liners. The game also added new weapons and items while maintaining the delicate balance of survival, horror resource management. The defensive items, daggers, and grenades that you can use to escape from enemy grabs, add a layer of security without making the game too easy. You have to decide when to use them and when to take the risk of dealing with enemies head on. The inclusion of real-time weapon switching streamlines combat without removing the tension. The defensive weapons themselves are perfectly balanced. They're limited enough that you can't rely on them constantly, but present enough that you don't feel completely helpless. That moment when a zombie grabs you and the game prompts you to use a defensive item creates a split-second decision. Do I spend a valuable knife to guarantee my safety, or do I gamble on breaking free before taking too much damage? These micro decisions add up to create a constant state of tactical consideration. The multiple campaigns with Jill and Chris offer meaningfully different experiences. Jill has more inventory space and assistance from Barry, making her campaign slightly easier. Chris has less inventory space and no helpful partner, but he's more durable. These aren't just cosmetic differences, they change how you approach the game strategically. Jill can carry more items, allowing for more flexibility in puzzle solving and resource management. Chris has to be more careful about what he brings, requiring more trips back to item boxes and more careful planning. The unlockables and multiple endings provide excellent replay value. Different endings based on your actions and who survives create an incentive to play through multiple times. The special weapons you can unlock, the infinite rocket launcher, the samurai edge pistol, allow you to experience the game differently on subsequent playthroughs. The game respects your time while still offering significant replay value. What makes all of this work is that the 2002 remake understands that improving graphics and adding content isn't enough. The game had to maintain the core experience that made the original special. The fixed camera angles, controversial to some, are essential to the game's horror. They create a cinematic quality where you're not just playing a game, you're participating in a horror film. The angles are carefully chosen to create suspense, to hide threats, to make familiar spaces feel different as you approach them from new directions. The tank controls, similarly, are deliberate. They make movement feel weighty and committed. You can't just run circles around enemies or backpedal away from threats. Every step requires thought. This makes the mansion feel more dangerous and the player feel more vulnerable. Modern twin stick controls would make the combat easier and more fluid, but that would fundamentally change what the game is. The awkwardness is the point. Horror should make you feel uncomfortable, unprepared, out of your element. The controls enforce that feeling. The game's difficulty curve is also perfectly calibrated. The early game is tense but manageable, teaching you the systems without overwhelming you. The mid game increases the challenge while providing you with better resources and equipment to handle it. The late game becomes intense as resources dwindle and enemies become more aggressive, but you've mastered the mechanics enough to handle it. The difficulty feels fair. When you die, it's usually because you made a mistake, not because the game cheated you. Puzzle design shows care and thought. The puzzles are logical but not obvious, requiring you to explore thoroughly and pay attention to environmental details. They're integrated into the mansion's design rather than feeling like arbitrary video game obstacles. A piano that needs to be played in a specific order, paintings that hide secrets, crests that open doors. These puzzles make sense in the context of a mansion designed by an eccentric architect with something to hide. They're satisfying to solve without requiring a walkthrough. The 2002 remake also benefits from its release context. In 2002, the fixed camera survival horror was still a dominant genre. Silent Hill, Dino Crisis, Clock Tower, these games shared similar design philosophies. The remake was working within established conventions, refining them rather than fighting against them. It wasn't trying to be something it wasn't. It was confident in its identity. This confidence shows in every aspect of the game. The remake doesn't apologize for what it is, or try to modernize in ways that would compromise its vision. It says, this is survival horror. This is deliberate and methodical gameplay. This is atmosphere over action, and it commits to that vision completely. The result is a game that feels focused and intentional, where every element serves the larger goal of creating a specific type of horror experience. Critics recognized this achievement. The reviews were overwhelmingly positive. IGN called it the prettiest, most atmospheric, and all-around scariest game we've ever played. GameSpot described it as one amazing game that clearly stands as the best the series has to offer. These weren't polite reviews giving credit for effort. They were genuine raves recognizing a masterpiece. The game won awards, topped best of year lists, and established itself as the gold standard for how to remake a game properly. And perhaps, most tellingly, the game has aged remarkably well. Play it today, 23 years after its original release, and it still works. The graphics, while not cutting edge, still look good because of the art direction and the quality of the pre-rendered backgrounds. The gameplay still creates tension. The horror still resonates. It doesn't feel like a relic. It feels like a well-designed game that happens to use a design philosophy that's fallen out of fashion. This is what distinguishes truly great game design from games that merely look good for their time. The 2002 Resident Evil remake was built on solid fundamentals: pacing, atmosphere, strategic resource management, exploration, environmental storytelling. These elements don't age because they're not dependent on technical capabilities. They're dependent on smart design and artistic vision. When people argue for a second remake, they're usually focusing on the surface level things. The graphics could be better, the controls could be modernized, the camera could be dynamic, but they're missing the deeper truth. The game doesn't need those things because it's already accomplishing exactly what it sets out to do. It's not trying to be a modern action horror game. It's trying to be a meticulously crafted survival horror experience that places atmosphere and tension over convenience and accessibility. The 2002 remake succeeded so completely at being what it wanted to be that it rendered future remakes unnecessary. This is the definitive version of the Resident Evil story. This is how the Spencer Mansion incident should be experienced, not because it's the newest or the flashiest, but because it's the most carefully considered, the most artistically coherent, the most successful at creating the specific experience it's aiming for. The bigger picture, what remakes mean for gaming's future. This discussion about Resident Evil specifically opens up to a much larger conversation about the gaming industry's relationship with its own history and its creative future. The decision about whether to remake the first Resident Evil again isn't just about that single game. It's symbolic of broader trends that should concern anyone who cares about gaming as an artistic medium. The entertainment industry has always had a complicated relationship with nostalgia. Hollywood has been remaking films for decades, reimagining old stories for new audiences. Music sees constant covers and reinterpretations of classic songs. Literature has its retellings and modern updates of classic tales. Nostalgia isn't new, and the impulse to revisit and reinterpret beloved works is understandable. But something different is happening in gaming now, something that goes beyond healthy nostalgia into something more concerning. The gaming industry is becoming increasingly risk averse at the day level. Development costs have ballooned. A major game now requires hundreds of people working for years, with budgets that can exceed $100 million. The financial stakes are enormous. One major flop can damage a studio irreparably or shut it down entirely. This creates an environment where publishers are terrified of taking chances. In this environment, remakes become attractive for all the wrong reasons. They're not commissioned because there's a burning creative vision to reinterpret a classic for a new generation. They're commissioned because they're safer. The game already exists. We know people liked it. We know roughly how many copies it sold. We can use that data to project sales for a remake. The marketing writes itself. Nostalgia is a powerful drug, and people will pay to revisit their childhoods. The risk is minimized, but this safety comes at a cost. Every major studio working on a remake is a major studio not working on something new. Every talented developer brought in to recreate a classic game is a talented developer who could be imagining new worlds, new stories, new kinds of gameplay. Every dollar spent on bringing the past forward is a dollar not spent on creating the future. The problem isn't that remakes exist. Good remakes serve legitimate purposes. They can make classic games accessible to new audiences. They can preserve important works that might otherwise be forgotten. They can demonstrate how far technology has advanced and how design philosophies have evolved. When done with genuine artistic intent, they can create something that honors the original while standing as a worthy work in its own right. The problem is when remakes become the default, when release calendars are dominated by reimaginings of games from the 90s and 2000s, when original intellectual properties become increasingly rare because publishers are more comfortable greenlit a remake of a proven property than taking a chance on something new. When entire studios are devoted to recreating the past rather than imagining the future. Look at the major releases from the past several years. Among the biggest, most celebrated games are remakes: Resident Evil 2, Final Fantasy 7, Demon's Souls, The Last of Us Part 1, Dead Space, Silent Hill 2, Resident Evil 4. These are generally excellent games that deserved their success, but they're not new. They're not fresh ideas. They're not taking creative risks. They're polishing and updating experiences that already existed. Meanwhile, new intellectual properties struggle. Forspoken was critically panned and commercially unsuccessful. The Callisto Protocol, despite an experienced team and significant marketing, failed to find an audience. These failures are then used to justify the continued focus on remakes. See, New ideas are risky, they don't sell, people want familiar properties. But this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Give remakes the big budgets and marketing pushes while starving new IPs, and of course the remakes will succeed while new properties struggle. This dynamic is particularly harmful for younger developers and new voices. The games industry needs fresh perspectives, new ideas, diverse voices that can imagine experiences we haven't seen before. But if the industry is primarily focused on recreating games from 20 or 30 years ago, where do these new voices fit? They're assigned to work on remakes, learning to recreate what came before rather than being empowered to create what comes next. There's something insidious about this. The remake factory trains developers to be archaeologists and restoration experts rather than visionaries and innovators. It teaches them to study and replicate rather than imagine and invent. And while there's value in understanding what made classic games great, there's a point where this becomes limiting. You can't create the next revolutionary game if your entire career has been spent recreating revolutionary games from the past. The financial success of remakes also creates a troubling feedback loop. Publishers see that remakes sell, so they commission more remakes. Developers who want to work on new projects find it harder to get funding because remakes are the priority. The most talented people get pulled onto remake projects because those have the biggest budgets. Original projects get smaller teams, smaller budgets, less marketing. They're set up to struggle, which then justifies the continued focus on remakes. This is culturally stifling. Gaming should be constantly evolving, constantly pushing boundaries, constantly asking what's possible. The medium is still young. There are so many types of experiences that haven't been explored yet, so many stories that haven't been told, so many ways of creating engagement and emotion that haven't been tried. But we can't discover those things if we're always looking backward. Consider what gaming has accomplished when it's been willing to take risks. The original Resident Evil created a genre. Half-Life revolutionized first-person narrative design. Grand Theft Auto 3 established the modern open-world template. Portal proved that puzzle games could be narratively compelling and emotionally resonant. Journey showed that online multiplayer could be wordless and contemplative. The Last of Us demonstrated that games could handle mature themes with genuine sophistication. Undertale proved that a solo developer could create something that resonated with millions. These weren't remakes, they weren't safe bets. They were risks that paid off because they had something new to say and new ways to say it. They became classics not because they recreated past glories, but because they imagined new possibilities. This is what gaming needs more of, not constant retreads of the Spencer Mansion, but new locations that will become as iconic. Not another trip through Raccoon City, but new cities that will become legendary in their own right. The Resident Evil franchise itself proves this point. The series has succeeded by taking risks and reinventing itself. Resident Evil 4 completely changed how the series played, introducing the over-the-shoulder camera and a more action-focused approach. It was controversial at the time, but it created something that influenced a generation of games. Resident Evil 7 took an even bigger risk, shifting to first person and adopting a tone closer to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre than to the series' usual B-movie camp. It could have failed spectacularly. Instead, it revitalized the franchise and created one of the best horror games ever made. These innovations happened because Capcom was willing to look forward rather than backward. They weren't content to just recreate what worked before. They asked what horror could be in the current gaming landscape, what scares contemporary players, what the series could become, rather than what it had been. That creative ambition is what keeps franchises vital and relevant. Now imagine if, instead of making Resident Evil 7, Capcom had decided to remake Resident Evil 1 again. We would have gotten a perfectly competent recreation of the Spencer Mansion with modern graphics and controls. It would have sold well, but we wouldn't have gotten the Baker House. We wouldn't have gotten the claustrophobic tension of playing in VR. We wouldn't have gotten the return to pure horror that the series needed. We would have gotten something safe and familiar instead of something bold and transformative. This is the opportunity cost that's often ignored in discussions about remakes. It's not just about what we get, it's about what we don't get. Every remake represents a path not taken, an original game that doesn't exist because resources went to recreating something that already does. The industry's current trajectory is unsustainable. There are only so many classic games that can be remade. Eventually, the well runs dry, and if we've spent these years building an infrastructure and a workforce that specializes in remakes rather than original creation, what happens when there's nothing left to remake? The industry will have atrophied its ability to create new things, and will be left scrambling to remember how to innovate. Gaming also has a preservation problem that remakes inadvertently make worse. When a remake becomes the definitive version of a game, the original can fade from memory. People stop playing it, stop discussing it, stop seeing it as relevant. The remake replaces it in the cultural consciousness. This might seem fine. The remake is better after all, but it erases the historical record. Future generations won't understand how games evolved because they'll only know the polished modern versions, not the original works that were created within specific technological and cultural constraints. The 2002 Resident Evil remake is valuable not just as a game, but as a historical artifact. It shows us what was possible in 2002, what developers were thinking about horror design at that time, how they approached the challenge of remaking a classic. If we remake it again, we don't erase the 2002 version. It's still there, but we diminish it. We suggest it's no longer good enough, that it needs to be superseded. We lose the opportunity to appreciate it on its own terms. There's also something to be said about artistic finality. Not everything needs to be endlessly updated and reimagined. Sometimes a work can be finished, complete, done. The 2002 remake achieved what it set out to do. It told the Spencer Mansion story as well as it could be told within its chosen design framework. That's an accomplishment worth respecting. Letting it stand as a complete work, rather than constantly revisiting it, honors the achievement of the developers who made it. The games industry needs to find a better balance. Remakes can exist, some are justified and serve real purposes, but they should be the exception, not the rule. The default should be new games, new ideas, new takes on what gaming can be. The vast majority of resources, talent, and attention should be focused on creating tomorrow's classics, not recreating yesterday's. This requires courage from publishers and developers. It requires being willing to take risks, to fund projects that might fail, to trust that audiences are hungry for new experiences, even if they're also nostalgic for old ones. It requires believing in the creative potential of the medium and the talent of developers to create something that hasn't been done before. And it requires something from us as players too. We need to support original games, especially from smaller and mid-sized developers who are trying to create new kinds of experiences. We need to be willing to take chances on games we've never heard of rather than just buying the latest remake because it's familiar and safe. We need to value innovation and risk-taking, even when it results in flawed games, because those flaws are often the growing pains of something genuinely new. The Resident Evil franchise doesn't need to remake the first game again. What it needs, what gaming needs, is for developers to take the lessons learned from those classic games and use them to create new experiences that will inspire the next generation. The best way to honor the legacy of the original Resident Evil isn't to recreate it with better graphics. It's to ask the same questions it asked. How can we scare players? How can we create tension through gameplay? How can we tell horror stories that resonate? And find new answers that are relevant to contemporary gaming. Conclusion: looking forward, not backward. So should Resident Evil 1996 be remade again? After exploring both sides of the argument, examining the specific case of the 2002 remake's excellence, and considering the broader implications for the gaming industry, the answer becomes clear: no. Not because remakes are inherently bad, not because there's no possible version of a modern remake that could be entertaining or commercially successful, but because the 2002 remake is already essentially perfect at what it sets out to do, and because the resources that would go toward remaking it again would be better spent creating new experiences that push the medium forward. The 2002 remake of Resident Evil stands as one of gaming's greatest achievements. It demonstrated that remakes could be more than simple graphical upgrades. They could be genuine artistic statements that honor their source material while expanding and improving it in meaningful ways. It created an experience that remains compelling and relevant 23 years later, that still scares players, that still stands as a benchmark for survival horror game design. That remake doesn't need improvement. It needs to be preserved, celebrated, and played by new generations who are willing to meet it on its own terms. The HD remaster already makes it accessible on modern platforms. Players who find the fixed cameras and tank controls too alienating have the recent Resident Evil remakes to explore the broader franchise. The first game exists in its definitive form. That should be enough. More importantly, the gaming industry needs to move beyond its current dependence on nostalgia and remakes. It needs to prioritize original creation, new intellectual properties, fresh voices with new perspectives. The constant looking backward is creating a creative stagnation that threatens gaming's development as an artistic medium. Every remake represents resources that could have gone toward creating something new, something that will become the classic future generation's treasure. The original Resident Evil was revolutionary because it tried something new. The 2002 remake was exceptional because it refined that innovation while adding its own creative touches. If we want to truly honor that legacy, we need to embody the same spirit of innovation rather than endlessly recycling what's already been created. We need games that will be as influential and beloved as Resident Evil has been, that will create new genres and new possibilities for horror in gaming. The Spencer Mansion has been thoroughly explored. The story of STAR's Alpha Team and the first outbreak has been told with care and artistry. What remains is for developers to create new mansions, new teams, new outbreaks, new horror experiences that will inspire the same conversations and the same passion that Resident Evil has generated for nearly 30 years. Gaming is still a young medium with so much potential waiting to be unlocked. We shouldn't spend these crucial years of growth constantly looking over our shoulders at where we've been. We should be looking ahead at where we could go. The best way to honor Resident Evil isn't to remake it again. It's to create new games that will inspire future developers the way Resident Evil inspired the current generation. It's to push horror gaming forward into territories we haven't explored yet. It's to prove that we can create new classics, not just recreate old ones. The 2002 Resident Evil remake should stand as a monument, not just to what the game was, but to what remakes can accomplish when they're done right, at the right time, for the right reasons. And then we should let it stand and turn our attention to what comes next. Because gaming's greatest moments aren't behind us, they're ahead of us, but only if we're willing to create them rather than endlessly recreating the past. The horror genre in gaming is ripe with possibility. There are fears we haven't explored, stories we haven't told, experiences we haven't created. The next great horror game won't be a remake. It will be something new that makes us rethink what horror in games can be, the way Resident Evil did in 1996, the way the remake did in 2002, the way Resident Evil 7 did in 2017. That's the legacy worth pursuing. That's the future worth building. Let the Spencer Mansion rest. The secrets have been revealed. The horrors have been faced. The story has been told. It's time to find new mansions, new secrets, new horrors. It's time to create the games that will define the next era of horror gaming, rather than constantly retreading the games that defined the last one. That's not abandoning the past, it's learning from it and using those lessons to build something better. The answer to whether Resident Evil should be remade again is no, but the answer to whether the gaming industry can create horror experiences that will be as influential, as beloved, and as enduring as Resident Evil has been, that answer should be yes. We just have to be brave enough to try.